Well, hey, punk rocker. Okay, I just got back from the Odyssey, and let's talk about it. This video is about storytelling. I have good things, bad things, and ugly things to discuss with you. Now, I start off most of my videos by looking into the camera and saying, hey, punk rocker, because you and I here on this side of the threadbare velvet ropes that separates our little scene from the rest of the algorithm, we are iconoclasts who understand that not every story needs to be told the way everyone else has told that story in the past, and sometimes it's good to deviate from that pattern in order to come at a given narrative from a different perspective. And therefore, I am about to give you my hot take that might turn some of you off immediately. And my hot take is, with regards to the Odyssey or regards to just about any story that has been told and retold, there is no canon. We're talking in this case about a 3,000-year-old story that is steeped with magic and mythology. So we don't have to adhere to a specific canon of how to tell that story. However, we are also not absolutists. And so to say there is no canon does not mean that there is never a need to hew to the core principles of a given narrative. This is me talking about storytelling. This isn't me trying to adhere to some kind of way that the Odyssey must be told. What I'm trying to deliver right now is my personal philosophy, if you will, on storytelling that I apply to the stories that I try to tell and the kind of advice that I would give to a writer who is seeking advice. So I'm going to try to keep what I have to say today with regards to this particular version of the Odyssey. I'm going to try to keep it to what we saw on the screen and the storytelling choices from this particular movie and not some greater narrative. However, I am steeped in the mythology of my ancestry. I have read the Odyssey in many different translations, and I happen to be listening to the audiobook of the latest translation, beautifully read by Claire Danes, as translated by Emily Wilson. And it is a translation that I like quite a bit. But not only that, but these stories were told to me by my mother as if they were family stories. I grew up with these characters as if they were elder cousins that I had never met. And the family is, for instance, not ever really going to invite Uncle Jason over. So I have a complicated history with the canon of this story, and so it's going to be hard for me to keep to my thesis of only talking about the story as it was delivered to us, only talking about the storytelling choices made by Christopher Nolan and the cast and crew of this particular story. But let me jump right in and say, I kind of dug it. I thought there were a lot of good points, and I have some quibbles. I have notes. Christopher, if you're listening, I welcome any feedback from you because I have some feedback for you. Let's get some things right out of the way immediately. I am going to end this ramble by talking about race and ethnicity and the ownership of this story. But right up at the top, let me say that I don't have a problem with who was cast in any of these roles. And I think it's really actually a waste of your time if you have a problem with it. Like, what are you trying to achieve with this? I also think that the flip side of people making the similar argument to what I'm making by saying that this is a work of fiction and therefore it shouldn't matter is also far too reductive. I will, again, circle back to this particular issue at the very end, and I hope that you stick around for that. And those of you who do, thank you. From this point forward, obviously, spoilers for this 3,000-year-old story and for this movie, which is a few weeks old. I liked it. I thought that it was Nolan's best movie since Memento. I thought it was told in a very similar style to Memento, and I appreciated that. It was very disjointed and jumped from event to event to event to event to event, and was very like the sort of anecdotal way that Homer delivers the story to us, particularly in the first half or third of the story, the mini Odyssey, Telemachus's journey to visit the various men who he is seeking to find news of his father, the Telemachiad, where he gets these little dribs and drabs of stories. Each one of them is sort of hearsay, which even if you're trying to adhere to Homer's telling, you have to understand that within Homer's telling, the people who are telling the story, the various voices of the story, are themselves not reliable narrators. So I appreciated that. I appreciated the way that we would be inside of a conversation which told you that another conversation would be taking place soon. I've got to go and talk to so-and-so, and then smash right quick cut into the middle of that conversation with no interlude. And I liked that. It was very sort of French New Wave. It was breathless storytelling in the way that Breathless was breathless storytelling. It reminded me also of John Boorman. If you've ever seen Point Blank, and if you haven't, you should. Point Blank is itself told in this mythological way. The character Walker, his name even is similar to Odysseus's name. I mean, we now call a trip an Odyssey because of him. Walker is named Walker. He's walking around in order to reacquire the money that was stolen from him because he was left for dead. But I guarantee you that and that story is told in a very disjointed, non-linear way of smash cuts, and so was this. But one thing that the French New Wave and John Boorman was not afraid to be, that I feel like Nolan was afraid to be, was weird. And I don't understand why Nolan chose to remove the magic and the gods from this story in the way that he did. Ostensibly, like they did when they retold the Iliad a few years ago, a few decades ago with Brad Pitt. They took the gods out, and the rationale for that is to like bring it down to earth, right? We're going to tell this story in a real way. This is potentially the way it really happened. And over the intervening thousands of years, over the intervening 800 years between when the war of the Iliad actually took place and when the retelling of it via Homer would have taken place. Over those intervening years, it was mythologized in such a way that the gods were inserted into it. I think I got the timeline wrong there. I think, is it 800 years from the actual Iliad to Homer, or from the actual Iliad to classical antiquity? Doesn't matter. It's many, 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 many years. You can challenge me on that in the comments. But the point is, that kind of grounded in reality storytelling is the rationale for removing the gods. But Nolan still has Circe turning the men literally into pigs. In that scene, I thought when the men were around that table that they were figuratively going to be pigs because they're eating so with such disgusting fervor. But no, she does literally turn them into pigs. So there was indeed magic. And Scylla and Charybdis were literal, and the Cyclops was literal. So why then remove the gods and the magic? I love the idea of Athena being a hallucination, a PTSD flashback remnant scar from the horrors of war. But you can't have that and have the magic, the sirens. I'm jumping ahead because what I'm wearing today, I haven't gone off topic, I promise. Before I went to see the movie, just on a lark, I put an array of Greek t-shirts out to mostly TikTok, but also across my social media to say, what should I wear? What does a Greek, Italian, American indie author wear to go see the Odyssey? And I put up this array of shirts. And this was the shirt that was selected, and so off I went. I haven't gone off topic, I promise. And I posted another video of me in this shirt on my way to the movie, and somebody commented on that second video. And he said, "Sweet, looking forward to getting your take, and rocking the aviators to really accent the look." And I said, if I'm not contrasting colors, what am I even doing? And then he said, I assume writing badass novels, of course, though that can still be done in contrasting colors, I've heard. And accidentally, that has created the theme of this reaction, because that's what I feel. Although I enjoyed the storytelling, that's what I feel was lacking from the storytelling. Contrasting colors. And I wish that we had been offered those contrasting colors. The design choices, the performance choices. This is not, when I say the performance choices, I'm not talking about the quality of the performances. I'm talking about the choices. The delivery of those choices across the board, I think, was good, was well done. I can't think of one weak link in the cast. There was no one who came on screen, and every time they did, I was like, oh, another scene with this character. That never happened. However, where was the contrast? Let's start with the design choices. Everything was so gray and taupe and beige. I alluded to not being an adherent to canon, and the same goes for historical accuracy. I am not necessarily on the side of the various historians, anthropologists, archaeologists who have been very upset in the lead up to this movie, upset online, that they weren't adhering to Bronze Age technology and Bronze Age armor and wardrobe, etc. I would have loved to see that. I'm not saying I don't want to see that. I still think it would be amazing to see a suit of armor made out of boar's tusks. But I didn't need that. But I did need some contrast in the wardrobe. At the very end, we saw a little bit of color on Penelope, thank God. And Anne Hathaway, who I thought was very good as Penelope. She was a good choice for Penelope. And she looked great in that dress at the end with the high-necked golden collar and the blue indigo dress. It was pretty much the only color in the whole movie. The whole thing could have been sepia tone. And I don't understand, well, I do understand that choice. It's this choice of bleeding color out of things because it supposedly makes them more realistic. It's the same thing as taking the magic out. We're gonna bring this back down to earth. We're not gonna go over the top. We're not gonna go Technicolor like they did when they adapted these stories back in the 50s and 60s with Kirk Douglas or with Ray Harryhausen. No, we're going to tell it in a real way. But that's, first of all, not how real life looks. It's not how I'm dressed today. It's not how I was dressed yesterday. Color exists in the world. It existed then in the world. And it is a lie that we have to drain the color from the world in order to tell a true story. That is the artifice. That is the false retelling of a story. But again, setting aside some kind of historical accuracy, I would have preferred they all be in Versace. Look at speaking of Claire Danes, look at Romeo and Juliet with her and Leonardo DiCaprio. The choices that were made in that with John Leguizamo using the language of Shakespeare. This was not a retelling of Romeo and Juliet. This was Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, the words of the bard in the mouths of the cast. And look at the way they were dressed. And maybe it worked for you and maybe it didn't, but it was a bold, interesting choice. Where was the bold and interesting choice? There was one. I happened to not like it. I did not like the design for Agamemnon. He looks like a bottle of Drakkar Noir. But you know what? I would have preferred that they took the design ethos of Drakkar Noir, of that particular armor, that particular set of armor, the design language of Agamemnon should have been the design language for the entire film. I hated that wardrobe, but it was a choice. In real life, the Greeks thought that anyone who wore trousers was a barbarian. And at the very end, for some reason, Tom Holland appears in a kilt in the final sequence. And I have to say, I felt so at home when he did. And I am not a utilikilt kind of guy. But, oh, look at that. He got out of his gray sweatpants. I don't understand the reticence to, again, I do understand. You know what it is? And I would hate to put too fine a point on this, but here we go. It's homophobia and white supremacy. God damn it. Now, I'm not accusing Christopher Nolan of anything. Christopher Nolan is a product, just like we all are, of the society that we live in. And I'm not saying that he intentionally made those choices based on those ugly philosophies. Not intentionally. But those ugly philosophies are what has taken the color out of our wardrobes. Okay, I want to go back to talking about the things that I liked. I really liked the way that the story jumped from incident to incident to incident in the way that someone telling the story might. And I thought that that was an exciting way to keep things moving. I loved the design of the Lastrygonians. I really liked that they never explained the Lastrygonians. You might not even know who I'm referring to because I don't think they ever said Lastrygonian out loud. Those were the armor-clad giants that chased them off of that one island that I don't believe had any dialogue at all except for that one screaming child. They had no motivation. We didn't even see them eat any of the men, which they are indeed in the Odyssey, cannibalistic giants. But that was such a bizarre sequence, and it was weird. It was Weird. Thank you, Nolan, for going weird in a couple of places. I loved how weird and disturbing it was when Circe turned the men into pigs. Oh, that was gorgeously done. I mean, it was terrible. It was awful to look at, but it was wonderfully done, reaching down their throats and pulling their faces into snouts instead of casting some kind of spell or having their food deliver some kind of magical potion that transformed them, which is as it was written. That was wonderfully done. I loved the deviation from the canon at the end for the finale. The Odyssey itself, as written by Homer, or as delivered to us over the eons by Homer's telling, has a very strange and unsatisfactory ending. And as that fight was happening in the dining hall, as Odysseus was taking on the suitors by himself, and he kept preventing Telemachus from joining the fight, I was confused. I was sitting there wondering, what is going on? This is not how it happens in the story, in Homer's telling. And I admit, I was sitting there going, this doesn't make sense. This isn't how it happened. I was adhering to the canon in my mind. I was adhering to the story that I know. But the ending beyond the story of the Odyssey, the ending beyond the ending that Homer delivered to us, is opaque. There are several different myths of how Odysseus died, whether he did or did not remain in Ithaca. Did he go west? Did he go north? Was he killed by his other son, whose mother was Circe? But when it became clear that this law of Zeus was inviolate, and that's why Telemachus had been so inactive for the years and years that the suitors were in the home, and violating that law, even though the suitors themselves were in violation of it, would have been unforgivable for Telemachus. And then for Odysseus to understand that, I honestly, I really thought that he was going to die in Penelope's arms in that moment. And when he said that no, he wasn't going to die, he was going to be exiled, I could have wept. Because that is a beautiful way to end that story. And because there is no canon, we can give that beautiful ending to Odysseus and Penelope. And I accept that ending, even though it isn't any one of the many varied endings that come to us from the ancient sources, none that I've ever seen. It's a wonderful idea. I could have wept. And I am a man who weeps. But I did not weep in that moment. And now we're coming to beyond the design of the film. What did not resonate with me, the choices, the performance choices, and the writing choices, the storytelling choices that did not resonate with me. It had no heart. It had no contrasting colors. It had no beauty. It had no love. Christopher, I know that you can deliver that to us because you did in Memento. So similar to Memento, our main character is trying desperately, desperately, desperately to return to his wife. In Memento, he has lost his memory in such a way that he has this disjointed set of fragments of photographic moments that he can recall. They're out of order, and they're not always the same when he flips to a given moment, like a slideshow. And there's one moment in particular that he comes to with his lost wife, lost in the sense that he cannot find her, because in the telling of that story, it isn't clear if she is alive or if she is dead. But there is so much love in the isolated, strange little moment that the man and wife share with each other in Memento. And structurally, thematically, it's very like the scene in Flashback that Odysseus and Penelope share before Odysseus goes off to war. But the scene with Penelope and Odysseus before he goes off to war has no love in it. They have sex at the end of it for some reason, but they're not in love in that scene. They don't demonstrate being in love. They demonstrate angst, fear, loss. It's not that they're unemotional, but there's no joy in them. Why does Odysseus want to go home? If there was joy in that moment, if there was beauty in that moment, if there was contrast in that moment, then when Odysseus and Penelope get to be together at the end in exile and sail off into the West, and sailing off into the West has always been a metaphor for death across cultures. But off they go together. It could have been so beautiful. I would have wept. But there was no beauty. There was no beauty. They spoke so much about the sea peoples and that the war is coming and who are these people. I thought it was brilliant that in the end it turned out that the Greeks are the sea people, that they are the ones bringing destruction across the Mediterranean. They are the cause of the late Bronze Age collapse, which is a real event in history, which many historians and scholars and etc. believe the Trojan War might have been a part of, and it makes perfect sense. This was a period in which established civilizations across the Eastern Mediterranean were collapsing, were being sacked and burned by an unknown people or set of peoples referred to by the Egyptians, which were one of the very few civilizations to survive the Great Bronze Age collapse. The Egyptians identified these people as the Sea People, or the Sea Peoples. And that's it. There was no name for where they came from. And the idea that the Argives, that the Greeks coming to Troy and destroying Troy could have been a part of that collapse makes perfect sense. But they kept talking about how their civilization was going to be coming to an end and they were going to be entering into a dark age. But how were they not already in a dark age? There was no beauty anywhere. Troy wasn't beautiful before they destroyed it. Ithaca wasn't beautiful. Sparta wasn't beautiful. There was a juggler in Sparta juggling torches, and he looked depressed. If Sparta had been beautiful and joyous, if that feast in Sparta had been glorious, and yet Menelaus and Helen were still unhappy. That contrast, like the contrast that my friend referred to between my sunglasses and this shirt, would have stood out and made us see the deep scars that go beyond the scars on the face that launched 1,000 ships, which was another wonderful choice. But in the context of this story, so what? Everyone was scarred. Everyone was ugly. There was no nuance. There were no characters. There was no color. Thank God for John Leguizamo. I think that he couldn't help but deliver a gleam of irony to his dialogue, a spark of insight to his blind character. I think he may have been the only one that brought that. And although I am going to save my screed on race and ethnicity until the end, I will say that I believe that John Leguizamo was the only Latino in the movie. His Puerto Ricanness, his unabashed passion with which he delivers himself to the world as an actor and as a human being came through in a way that none of the other actors brought. There was also no breath. Although we went from moment to moment, and I enjoyed that, the moments as we went into them just delivered the information that we needed to know in order to get through to the next bit of information. And there was no breath to it. The only time the movie ever slowed down, there were two moments in the movie that slowed down and tried to build some kind of tension instead of just like moving on to the next story point. It wasn't with the Cyclops. It wasn't with the Laestrygonians. It wasn't with Circe. It wasn't with Calypso. There was one unforgivable place where it wasn't, and I will come to that in a moment. The two places where it happened were two places where there was no tension. We knew exactly what was going to happen. It was when the Greeks were struggling to open the gates of Troy. For some reason, it took a long time to open the gates of Troy. And the storytellers were delivering to us the message that this was a tense moment and we don't know what might happen. Are they going to get the gates open? But the whole movie takes place after the gates have been opened. And we know that. We've seen scenes in the movie after the gates have been opened. There were other opportunities within the sack of Troy where we could have built tension. The death of the foe, Athena, for instance, could have been one of those moments, but that's not the moment that I'm saying was unforgivable. The other moment where we paused for tension was when when Odysseus, have I been saying Achilles by accident all this time? I just said it. I'm going to re-record this whole video. When Odysseus was trying to string his bow as a test in front of the suitors to prove that he was worthy. It's a classic trope. Only the chosen one can pull the sword from the stone, can lift the hammer of Thor. But again, we knew what was going to happen. There was never a question that he wasn't going to string that bow and pluck the string, which I loved. I loved the plucking of the string. That was a beautiful musical. You know what? That was beautiful. That was a beautiful choice. The plucking of the bow. That one musical choice was beautiful. But there was no tension. There was no tension in that moment, and yet for some reason that was the moment that Nolan chose to slow down and try to make us worry that he wasn't going to pluck that bow. But the thing is, this story, again, is 3,000 years old. There are no spoilers for the story points, right? The story points that we all know were all in the movie. As an adherent to canon, you have nothing to complain about. All the story points were there. And therefore, there's no tension in those moments, but there's nothing wrong with that. That's this story. Just like we all know the story points of Romeo and Juliet, for instance. What matters in the retelling isn't just delivering the story points. What matters is how you deliver them. Who are the humans embodying the tropes? Everyone was so grim all the time that there was no time to build any character. When they pass through Scylla and Charybdis, and Odysseus has lied, or at least lied through omission to his men, he knows about the whirlpool, and he tells them about the whirlpool, but he has to lie to them so that they will pass close enough to the rocks instead of to the whirlpool, even though he knows that men will die. It is a classic trope for an officer to have his second in command be his foil, to be someone that challenges his authority and maybe is the only one that can kid him, or is the one who is always there to back him up, the sidekick, the loyal friend that knows more about the hero than anybody else, that can see through his foibles but won't ever expose those foibles to anyone. And I don't want to take anything away from Himesh Patel's performance. Again, I'm not talking about performances being bad. I'm talking about performance choices, and these choices come from the script and from the direction. But imagine if in that moment, after Scylla has taken the 6 men from the crew, and by the way, I loved the design of Scylla. It was so elder god Lovecraftian. But imagine if in that moment, instead of him turning to Odysseus and going, you knew, with the same grimness that every line in the film was delivered with, that intense, important grimness. What if instead of that moment of, I'm going to be grim and important again, what if he had turned to him and gone, what the fuck was that? What the fuck was that? Are you kidding me? Again? Right? I mean, I am not a veteran. I've never been in combat. I'm not going to pretend that I know what it's like to be under fire. But if you are watching and you are a veteran, back me up or refute what I'm about to say. But there are 3 things that you hear from the war stories. What is it that the veterans come back from war having experienced? Terror, boredom, and humor. But the only thing that this movie delivered to us via these veterans was the grim terror. And I get that. But again, the contrast. I'll never forget this footage that I saw. 3 British soldiers in Iraq taking a break during a patrol. They have their helmets off, and they're having a little conversation about a sniper takes a shot, hits the wall that they're standing in front of. Bullet throws chips off the wall. They flinch out of the way, and then they immediately start laughing. In the heat of this moment of near death. Now, I have had moments in my life near death that had nothing to do with combat and had a similar reaction. And it would have been such a great contrast to see some of that in this movie, because the grimness just made me weary. Even Circe's hut was a hut. It was a hovel. It was barely made of sticks. I have no problem with her performance. She was wonderful. Her character was so greatly diminished, but that's a storytelling choice that could have worked. It could have worked if there was a place that those men wanted to go to that was actually attractive. All of those suits of armor behind Circe's hovel imply that men keep coming there, but why? It's a filthy, run-down hovel. There is nothing there to attract you to it unless you are as lost as Odysseus, and we've established that Odysseus is the only one that is this lost. Calypso herself, of course, was beautiful, but her island was a bleak, sandy strand. There was no beauty there. She was beautiful only because she was played by Charlize Theron, who is herself beautiful. But there was no beauty in Calypso. And there was no beauty in Calypso's island. The only thing that kept Odysseus there was being addicted to the drug. There was no beauty that kept him there. There was no comfort that kept him there. You can move from place to place. You can jump from story to story to story. You can jump from incident to incident in the way that John Boorman does in Point Blank and deliver an effective story. But within the jumps, I saw a video from another friend of mine recently, and I was struck. It was after I had seen the Odyssey. And I was struck because I'm an Uber driver, And I was driving a homeless woman from one place to another. And I asked her, now, I guarantee you that in the context of the screenplay for the Odyssey, Nolan would have cut from one place to another, because that's what Uber drivers do. I mean, there's no point in getting into an Uber if you're not going from one place to another. But storytelling isn't bare delivery of information. Storytelling is an unfolding of the narrative from one place to another. Allows the teller of the story to take a breath, to lead into. And I asked her, it gives the listener the moment to understand, to appreciate the velocity of the story. I'm an Uber driver, and I was driving a homeless woman from one place to another. And I asked her, or I'm an Uber driver, I was driving a homeless woman, and I asked her, I am Menelaus, brother of Agamemnon, son of Atreus, husband of Helen. He just says it. He just boom, bang, says it. And then he eats like a pig. Everybody is brash. Everybody is eating like a pig. There's not one person who eats with good manners. Not one. There's no contrast. So what that he eats like a pig? His whole banquet doesn't appreciate the food in front of them. You barely see them. The suitors eat like pigs. Odysseus' men eat like pigs. Everyone eats like pigs. There was no breath in the breathless storytelling. There were no moments. And the moment that Nolan failed to give us, that I will never forgive him for, a moment in which I did weep, and I'm probably going to weep right now telling it to you. But the only reason I did weep is because I have known this story since I was a child. But Argo, the hunting dog, waits for 20 years until his master finally comes home. What an opportunity for beauty. Heartbreaking beauty. An opportunity for love. And Matt Damon has his fucking back to the camera. And we can see that the dog has died only because its tail vibrates and then ceases to move. Are you fucking kidding me? We don't get to look into Odysseus's eyes or Argo's eyes. We don't get to see the moment that Argo recognizes Odysseus. The oldest dog that Eumaeus has ever known waited 20 years. Have you ever known a 20-year-old dog? The only reason that dog is alive is because it's waiting for Odysseus to return. And Christopher Nolan, I will never forgive you for not showing us that dog. Futurama did it better. Futurama did it perfectly. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, don't Google it. It'll break your heart, just like it should. Just like Christopher Nolan failed to break my heart. I was so angry in that moment. It's the hardest moment in the movie to fumble. I mean, how do you fumble that? And he fumbled it on purpose. He took the heart out on purpose. I can't forgive that. And I know that he's capable of it because of Memento. He's done it. He can deliver that. But he refused. I'm not drinking this fast enough. What else did I like? I liked the design of the Cyclops. It was a choice. I liked the choice. It wasn't a choice that I would have made, but I did like the twisted face, and it made it look like a birth defect in the same realm of possibility as a cleft palate or something like that. Obviously, on an extreme level. But if you take the magic out, if you make that a birth defect, how is it that he was also a giant? How do you explain Scylla and Charybdis? I don't understand removing the magic. Why were the sheep not giant sheep? I liked the story elements that were introduced. I liked the connection between Antoninus and Sinon. I thought that was a good element. I liked the casting of the lots. But we could have had some scenes with Elliot Page that would have mattered when he died. But honestly, I had no idea who he was when he died, and then later on we find out who he was. But by that time, we have done no character building. There was a great line at the end when he says, "Tell them what I've done," and then also to embellish the story. That was wonderful, conceptually wonderful, but delivered by a character who we had no history with because we hadn't been allowed to let the story breathe. So you can tell a sort of Penguin Classics anthology of Greek myths version of the story and hit all the story points, or you can delve into the characters and try to deliver a more realistic version of the stories, right? But you can't do both. And this telling tried to have it both ways. Let the story breathe. Find the moments that need to be drawn out. What are those moments? Is it whether or not the gates of Troy will be opened? Or is it whether or not young Sinon will live up to the promise of his youth? When he dies at the beginning of the movie, he's a 10-year veteran of war. He's been at war since he was the child soldier that we see draw the lot that sends him off onto one of those 1,000 ships launched by the face of Helen. He's not a raw recruit. Somehow he has maintained a flicker of youth and vitality. I'm not saying that's impossible. I'm saying I want to know how. I want it to matter. Nothing mattered. All of Odysseus's men that died were interchangeable. I don't know why the one character, the one sailor who removed the wax from his ears and jumped over the side of the ship to go and see the sirens, why? Why was it him? And why do I care? How is the crew lesser now that that particular guy is no longer there? I don't know. You can establish those kinds of things with so little breath, but none of that breath was taken. Who here joining me in this discussion is a fan of Star Wars? And who here can tell me who the men who died helping Luke destroy the Death Star were? Who were the X-Wing and Y-Wing pilots that died and what their personalities were? All of those guys were in one scene. One scene. And we know who they were. Porkins, oh my God. Stay on target. What an asshole. We didn't get any of that. None. No breath was taken. No humanity. Strip the humanity out because that's real storytelling. That's bringing it down to earth. No, it's not. Don't strip the humanity from your stories. This is a hit movie. Who am I to say that there are problems with it. What's the goal of your storytelling? Is your goal just to deliver a hit movie or a hit book? That's fine. No one will be talking about this rendition of the Odyssey in 10 years. They might be talking about how much money it made. These stories are cyclical. Someone's going to make another version of the Odyssey, and then someone will talk about how much Christopher Nolan's movie made. Maybe they'll talk about the controversy in the casting, something like that. But there was no breath here. There was no reason to talk about this story. I've been talking for unedited an hour and a half. But mostly what I'm talking about is that we have nothing to talk about. And that makes me sad because this is an important story. It's important because it's one of the oldest stories that we have. It's a fundamental story. We have other old stories. We have older stories, but we're not retelling them again and again. This particular story, we retell again and again because it touches us. It means something. We understand the homecoming. We understand the struggle. We understand the pain and the longing and the love. We understand the infidelity. We understand the betrayal in ways that some of these other ancient stories don't touch us, don't demand retellings, don't demand that we care about who's cast as certain characters. So it matters. It really does. It doesn't ruin the Odyssey. You can't ruin the Odyssey. You can't ruin Star Wars by having another movie come out that you don't like. That doesn't ruin the canon. That's nonsense. But it does hurt. It hurts because we care about the stories. Stories are what we have. And in the times we're living in right now, and I feel like I'm starting to stray into what is the final chapter of what I will be talking about, the controversy in the casting. And the times we're living in right now, where stories are literally being stolen from us by machines to be spit out, regurgitated back to us algorithmically. This matters more than ever. Stripping on purpose the humanity from our stories is doing their work for them. Our stories matter because we tell them. These are the stories of human beings. And trying to strip all the magic out, I'm going to reduce it just to its most core realistic beats. Why? 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 What is your thesis in doing that? Tell me your thesis. Give me your argument. Make it make sense to me. And I mean that literally. That's not a rhetorical prompt. If you're going to do that, why? What are you trying to achieve? If you're going to, for instance, say that you can use a specific device that artists used in the past in order to capture light in a certain way and prove, therefore, that Vermeer was not a genius and that you could replicate the girl with the pearl earring. Why? What does that bring to the world? What is your goal? To bring ugliness to the world? This movie attempted to end with beauty, but it had delivered so much ugliness along the way. It was nothing but ugliness along the way that it didn't allow for any beauty. Now, speaking of ugliness, the idea that no black woman should be cast as Helen is absolute ugliness. The idea that there must be some kind of weird faith to this Victorian notion of what ancient Greece was like is pure ugliness. That puts you on the side of the British Museum stealing the marbles from the Acropolis. Earlier, I said something about racism and white supremacy, and I want to make this very clear. The notion that these ancient Greek myths belong to the Western tradition and they are all of ours because of that is rooted in Victorian racism and white supremacy. The Victorians literally whitewashed the Greek myths. On the flip side of that, if you are defending the casting of Lupita Nyong'o by saying that the people who are in Greece now are not the people who were in Greece then, and that therefore it's completely reasonable that a black woman be cast in that role, you are repeating the tropes of the white supremacists. And I will pull no punches when I say that. Just like I said that Christopher Nolan was participating in homophobia and white supremacy by stripping all the color out of these stories, maybe without realizing it. Maybe you don't realize that you are participating in white supremacy when you say that. Because that is exactly the rationale that the Victorian era white Europeans, whether they were English or German, stripped Greece of its heritage by saying that the Greeks who are there now were not the Greeks of antiquity. Now, you may be saying that the Greeks of antiquity were actually black. They are saying that the Greeks of antiquity were actually white. But the Greeks of antiquity were Greek. The Greek side of my family has been in Greece since the Neanderthals. When my grandfather came to this country, he was not white. And Greeks in the United States have been white for maybe 2 generations. My grandfather was an officer in an organization known as AHEPA, a fraternal organization that wore fezzes like the Shriners, except that their fezzes came from their actual culture. And the very first bylaw of AHEPA was fighting the KKK. Don't try to defend Lupita Nyong'o by participating in white supremacy. I am defending the casting of Lupita Nyong'o because not only is it historically completely believable that Helen was as black as she is, but also that it doesn't matter, that it's good casting regardless of historicity. But don't try to remove the actual people whose story this is. The Greeks were one of the first targets of organized white supremacy. The Nazis claimed that they owned the Greek legacy because the people who occupied that land were not the people who were originally there in antiquity. The Victorian English did the same thing. When I was a kid, I was dating a girl while I was in college, and she, on one side of her family, was like DAR, Daughters of the American Revolution. And she knew that her grandmother was going to be very upset that we were dating. And she told her grandmother, in a kind of a, testing the waters kind of way, that I'm Greek. And she said, "What house?" Because she assumed that that meant that I was a member of a fraternity. And if you have ever been a member of a fraternity or a sorority, then you know that on campus you have participated in Greek life. And you may even call yourself a Greek. Think about that. Don't try to strip the culture away from a given people just because it's convenient for you, for your argument, whichever side you happen to be on. If you're trying to defend the fucking white supremacists who don't want a black woman to be cast as Helen of Troy, well, fuck you. But if you're a person of color saying that the Greeks who are there now are white Europeans and therefore not who this story is really about, and that you should be able to own the story, you're doing the same thing. That's enough of that. I don't want this video to be about that. This video is about storytelling. Storytelling is an interesting cultural phenomenon. It's something that makes us human. I think it's the thing that differentiates us from all the other animals on Earth. We used to think that it was making tools, and it turns out that's not true. We used to think that it was building societies, and it turns out that's not true. We used to think that it was agriculture, and that's not true. Ants do it. Making war. Chimpanzees do it. But storytelling, art in general, and storytelling in particular, is a uniquely human power and responsibility. You could take a story that doesn't belong to your culture and retell it. Just don't claim that it is yours. Acknowledge where it came from. That is how we move together as a human people. That is human storytelling. That's what I'd like to encourage. That's what I'd like to come away from with having a Boston Irish guy play Odysseus. I wish that they had all been wearing Versace. Thank you for joining me here on this side of the threadbare velvet ropes, where we break down stories, where we approach consuming and making art from the ethos of the DIY punk rock indie author, ethos of iconoclastic open-mindedness. I'm going to finish my very watery cocktail and see about editing this down into something that makes sense.